Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Want to welcome you to tonight's Green Living Seminar presentation. I'm Elena Traister, a professor in the Environmental Studies Department here at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. This semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme Capitalism and the Environment. All of these presentations are always free and open to the public. They take place here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121, on Wednesdays at 5:30. You can find our schedule and links to recordings of prior presentations on our website at www.mcla.edu/greenliving. Our presentation day will last for 45 minutes or so and be followed by our question and answer session. And before I turn it over to tonight's presenter, I wanted to make a quick plug for next week's presentation on Wednesday, April 5th. We'll be hearing from John Haidt of Clear Strategy, Inc., who will be giving a lecture titled Economics of Recycling and Producer Responsibility. Today's presentation, titled Managing Risk, Climate Smart Agriculture, will be presented by Jennifer Hashley, Director of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks Elena for the invitation. It's nice to meet all of you this evening. And my name's Jennifer Hashley, as she said. I'm the Director of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. I've been in that role for about 22 years. So I will tell you at the end of the presentation, if we have time, a little bit about what we do, but in a nutshell, just so you have a little bit of background, this is our barn at Moraine Farm. Those are our greenhouses out there in the field. We're a beginning farmer training program and run an incubator farm to help new farmers get started farming. So that's the quick and the dirty of it, but I'll go into a little bit more detail if we have time at the end. So I was asked to talk about what is climate smart agriculture? How do we incentivize farmers to do practices that are beneficial to the environment and things like that? And I'm going to talk a little bit about and give a background about why it's really a lot about managing risk, because I think we all know farming is inherently pretty risky. You're dependent on so many things outside of your control, and from pricing to weather to labor to, you're the kind of the producer, and then everything happens to your product after it leaves the farm gate. So there's a lot of things that happen in between there. So I thought we would start with some definitions. We're called the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, and I get asked a lot, well, what does sustainable really mean? And I'm sure you guys have probably talked about this already in your classes and other things that you're interested in. There's so many different models of how people define sustainability. It's usually, people, planet, the profit, the three-legged stool, all of those things and how they intersect. And so we're talking about this food system and thinking about how each of those pillars contribute to a food system, and farming and the planet piece is really important, but they're all really interrelated, and that kind of nexus is where the sustainability piece comes in. So how do all those pieces continue forward? There's other models that people use, putting the emphasis on is the economy the center of the system? Is the society, the people part, the environment, which is more important? So how do we decide which driver is leading your sustainability efforts? I love this one. I think you mentioned it in your email. I was part of a group out of Sterling College, and she came to speak to us. And really, I love this model as well. Just thinking about, where are we in terms of the balance between all the social things that we as humans control, and then we have this, economy where we're playing around with all these different pieces, and then this ecological ceiling. And we can either be overshooting and creating all of these challenges, or there's kind of a sweet spot where we can do things in a more regenerative way and mitigate some of these risks. So if you haven't read the book, I encourage you to get that, or listen to any of Kate Raworth's lectures or discussions where she really goes into a lot more detail about this model. And then I work in food systems, and farmers are obviously clearly part of the food system. And this is, traditionally what we see as the food system. Again, the economic, the social, the environmental, farming is part of it. There's little farmers up there, but they're part of this much larger interrelationship between, production and consumption and political systems and policies and culture and the biology and the waste recycling, and how do all these pieces fit together. And there's all of these things influence how agriculture works. and how we get food in our in our communities and how we survive and all those pieces. And this is a different kind of model that I liked. I just learned about it a couple weeks ago. In Philadelphia, they created an urban ag plan, and they really put land at the center of it. And I've never really seen a food systems diagram that puts land at the core of the food system, which I love. And then it's kind of like, all right, if the land is the basis and the soil is the basis, and that's the center that we work from and prioritize, that's going to create a different kind of approach to our food system and how we interact with it. And then the people are kind of on the outside. So there's a lot of different things we could define as what's sustainable or what's a system, and how do we work in it. So this is another graphic that's from the National Academies of Science, that there are links in all these different actors that we've been talking about in these systems where there's the supply chain and how food gets from farm gate to the consumer and back, but all of these things influence this, how this policy, how this works in the food system. From the policies, the markets, again, the biology and the science and technology and the physical environment and social organizations all play a role in how food moves from field to plate. And economic decisions are made at all facets of these interactions. And then the other terms that I think are important to talk about in relation to systems, and people use this term food shed. Well, what is a food shed? And if you're talking about your food system, is it a local food system, a regional food system, or a globalized international food system? So the food shed, really thinking about here in Massachusetts, one of our Friedman School professors did this graph. And one of the things I love to note about, here's Boston and 25 miles, and then we get to 50 miles and 75 miles, 100 miles. Sometimes, how do you define what your local food system is? Some people use 400 miles. Some people say it's 100 miles. And it's nice to see this map because you see most of our food system is actually underwater. Half of it's the ocean. And a lot of time fisheries don't even come into the equation when we think about food systems. But that's a really important part of our food system here in New England and globally, and thinking about how that plays into what is local and how we grow and transport and move food. We're also just interesting to think about this map when we go out even just 200 miles and things like that and get down into some of the most populous cities in the country. Farmers here on this part of the coastal areas are really fortunate that we have such huge population centers close to consumers in these population centers to buy their products. So I'll have some slides about local demand in a minute, and that's important to think about as well. So one of the challenges of this food system that we have, we think about in this wonderful utopic way that all these wonderful farmers are out there really caring for the land, stewarding the soil and all their natural resources, and they're making really important economic decisions and environmental decisions, and they're treating their workers well. And the reality is that, there aren't all of those little farmers scattered all over in the same way. When we think about the system as a whole, it's really been squeezing those farmers out of business and concentrating a lot of production in much larger and larger farms over time. So there's the small scale farmers, and then it's like, this vertical integration and consolidation among folks that are in the middle between processing and retail, and by the time it gets to you. And the number of companies that are doing that has shrunk a lot. And that's been a large part through mergers and acquisitions. So this is just another slide talking about some of the big areas of the food system that are consolidating rapidly. And crop seeds and biotechnology and agricultural chemicals and machinery and animal health, all of these things are, it's getting harder and harder to have any choice as a farmer or even a consumer. And a lot of that goes on behind the scenes. We don't even realize that choice and diversity and all of these things are being taken away because we just go to the grocery store and we see food there. But there's a lot of things happening in the background. And I don't know if you've been familiar with Philip Howard's work out of Michigan State. He does a lot of mapping of consolidation of different sectors and industries. If you like to drink beer, he's also got a consolidation map of the beer industry. It's not as diverse as it seems. There's one of his beer beverages. But yeah, there's 65% of our chemicals, agrochemicals, are owned by 4 companies. Animal pharma, same thing, seed companies, and that's one of the really challenging things when you think about it, our seed industry. and who controls the genetics of the future. So these things all play into the economics that farmers are dealing with. This is another graph I loved. I pulled that out recently. You know, we're also hearing a lot in the news about cellular agriculture, you know, especially related to climate change. People are really concerned about animal agriculture and, you know, the way that we produce animals. And so there's a lot of villainization of meat and things about how do we become more sustainable? How do we feed, you know, so many billions of people in the next 50 years? Well, we're going to turn to the lab and grow meat from cells. And so there's a lot of investment in that space. And I think I just heard the other day that the FDA just approved cellular grown chicken. So they're making headway. I haven't tried it yet, but has anybody here had an Impossible Burger? Other things? All right, so it's coming, but there's still some challenges and things like that, but there's a lot of swirl in the industry and who's making investments in the space and how quickly that will move forward. So something to pay attention to. And when we think of this consolidation and all the things that go on, and you've probably seen this graph, like what's the farmer share of the food dollar in this whole system? Like the people that are actually on the ground caring for the soil, putting in these practices you know, that are impacting the environment or benefiting the environment, they're getting such a small share of the dollar. So how do they have the resources to invest in the practices that we want to see over time, when so much of the dollar is tied up in other parts of the food system? So what has happened over time is, and this is not anything new, but people often don't think about the fact that farmers farm and most of them have off-farm jobs. So the way that they can afford to be farmers and to care for the land and the soil and produce food is to have a side hustle somewhere else, or farming is their side hustle and their primary income comes from elsewhere. So that's you know, not the notion that we think about, you know, the bucolic farmer, you know, getting up in their overalls and going out to work the land and that's their job. It's one of the few professions that we expect somebody to do. We all depend on food, but you know, if in order to do that, you have to have livelihood somewhere else. Thank goodness our doctors and teachers and other folks don't have to have side hustles to make their career work for them. But it's a real challenge. And some of the other things that are really hard as well for anyone farming, whether you're large scale or small, is finding the right kind of land. You know, we really prioritize development over food production in so many parts of the country, and even in places where there's vast quantities of land, it's, you know, if someone doesn't have a successor to you know, continue that farming tradition in their family, it gets bought up by the neighbor or bought up by the larger farm down the road, and so farms get larger and larger, and that makes it really hard for new people to get into the business of farming. You know, is it available? Is it decent, good quality soils to grow on? You know, is it suitable for what they want to do? Can they afford it? How do you capitalize and amortize this huge asset of land, you know, and then make it work? And land is not just a farm. You also need all the infrastructure that goes with the land, you know, depending on what kind of business you're doing. So it can get quite expensive quite quickly. The other interesting thing is almost 80% of farmers lease or rent most of their land. Or some portion of their land. Not everybody owns their own land. And then thinking about equity, how do you build equity if you don't own the land? And we also have to acknowledge at this point, there's a huge history of land theft and racism in this country. Like, this wasn't our land to begin with. Other people were living and utilizing and growing food on this land before colonization. And that's also been a huge consideration of who gets to farm in this country, who has access to farm. You know, 98% of farmland in this country is owned by white people, and less than 1% owned by people of color. So that's a huge factor in terms of equitability and who has access and who grows our food and what kind of food is grown. The other issue we have is most of these farmers that even are farming, they're getting old. The average age is, this was done a few years ago, and you know, looking at the 2012 census, but you know, the average age was 58. I think it's now like 58.7 or something. They just did we're doing the census right now. So the last census was in 2017, and they'll have another one published. They do it every 5 years in 2022. But American Farmland Trust and Land for Good and others did a deep dive of the census, really looking at the age of farmers in New England, and found across almost all the New England states that, you know, there's a huge majority of farmers that are over the age of 65 and don't have anyone under the age of 45, or have very few people under the age of 45 that are planning to take over their farm. So as these farmers get older, there's a lot of acres of farmland that's at risk that doesn't have a future successor. So we need a lot of people to be continuing in this field to grow food. But we just talked about how do they get access to land and capital and infrastructure and the significant investment that needs to happen to get into this work. And then we're talking about climate change. It's like, who wants to do that when you have no idea if you're actually going to be able to produce and sell something at the price that will actually generate a profit so that you can cover your expenses and pay your workers fairly and continue to invest. So this is what has happened over time, given the situation. We have fewer and fewer, as farms have gotten larger and larger, and we have fewer and fewer people actually working on the farm. And some people call this progress, right? Like, oh, this is great. We've become so efficient and we can grow so much more at scale. We don't need as many people to be working the land. We don't need as many farmers to grow the amount of food that we're growing. But over time, land has stayed pretty stable, but farm size has gotten much larger, and we've gotten fewer and fewer farms overall. So all these changes have led to those outcomes. But fortunately, consumers have kind of woken up to this, I would say, over the last 10 or 15 years. The local food movement has helped change some of these statistics where, when I started in this work over 20 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of buzz about local food or local anything. It was just like you go to the store, you get your food, that's it. And then we started having all these food scares and these films like Food Inc. and others that kind of started to expose the underbelly of confinement agriculture and the environmental impacts of that, and food scares, and people really started waking up to be like, oh, well, this is not great. I think I want to know where my food comes from. And so we've seen a whole renaissance in the last couple of decades of more community-supported agriculture programs and farmers markets. And during the pandemic, obviously people woke up and were like, oh my gosh, there's lines at the grocery store, shelves are empty, like I need to turn to my local and regional farmers. And it's like, okay, well, they're not just here overnight, right? Like they need to be supported all the time. And so we've seen this as, it is increasing. Local food sales were about $5 billion across the country, many years ago. And in 2020, the last survey that USDA has done, that it was up to $9 billion. So there's definitely more opportunity economically for farmers to engage in local sales, as long as you have a business that you can sell directly to consumers and capture most of that dollar. The dollar that we saw before is more commodity agriculture, where you're selling a product to a processor who's going to then turn it into Wheaties or cornflakes or corn syrup or into any number of other processed products, versus what we're talking about here with our local food system sort of changes those economics when you can get almost the full value of the dollar directly to the farm. So a lot of these farmers, though, who are having more of an opportunity to capture more of these dollars are really located in metropolitan areas. We're not talking about kind of the ag of the middle or the larger folks that can't just put 3,000 acres in the back of a truck and go sell it to consumers directly. So it's a different kind of agriculture and a different kind of economic reality in agriculture. But this is kind of one of the bright lights after all the dim and gloom. Just trying to say there are people that are doing really important work in feeding our communities. A lot of it is really specialty crops, specialty vegetables. So most of the farmers that are selling direct to market, we talked about what is local, 78% are selling within 100 miles of their farm, and that's what they're kind of thinking about as local. And you can see that trend has really increased over the last amount of time here. And we're kind of lucky here in New England. We're almost in the mecca of local, which is interesting. We have some of the highest percentage of direct farm sales in the country. The top 4 of the top 10 states in the country are here in the Northeast. Obviously, New York is a big one, but I think we're like number 10th on the list in Massachusetts. So we do a lot of direct marketing here. And I'm saying all this because this really, like the economic situation that our farms here in locally are also what drive other types of practices. So if you can make money, you have more flexibility to be doing things a little bit differently on your farm. So consumers, to sum this part up, they really want to have food that has good nutrition, good quality, it's fresh, it's flavorful, interesting, unique varieties, can stay longer on the shelf. It hasn't traveled the average of 1,800 to 2,000 miles from somewhere else. People kind of want to know how are farmers farming? Like, are they organic? Are they sustainable? Are they using harsh chemicals? Are they eroding the soil? Are they treating their workers fairly? There's a lot of values that people put in their purchasing when they're making a distinction between buying one product or another once they educate themselves about the differences. And when you're buying local, you're also supporting your local community. Most of those dollars that you spend with a local farmer are staying within your local community. And that helps also drive demand for conserving more farmland to make those opportunities available. So one of the things that is interesting as we try to drive demand, I don't know if folks have read the 50 by 60 New England food vision of like, what if we could imagine growing 50% of our food by 2060? What would that look like? And so this is a group that put that vision together. They're in the process of revising it, but it's got a lot of interesting conversation about what we would need to do differently. We would need to probably take trees down and open up more fields. We'd need to change what we eat. Those all have implications too for climate change, and how do we grow more food locally here if we don't already have the land open and in agriculture and ready for food production? So another study that was done by some folks at Tufts as part of a Northeast-wide search did a comparison of like, well, what could we produce here and what do we actually consume here, and do they match up? And that's really interesting. We produce about 50% of the dairy that we consume in this region, in New England. So half of it has to come from elsewhere. If we wanted to grow, half of our food by 2060, we're doing okay with dairy and cows, although that's also changing. It's, the dairy industry has taken a huge hit given how, again, consolidated it is in the price of milk, and where we're now shipping fluid milk from other parts of the country here, which is also not environmentally smart to ship fluid milk all over the place. But in the vegetable sphere, we still produce maybe 35% or so, but of that, most of that's potatoes. Maine has a huge potato industry. So it's not really a lot of the vegetables that we eat, although I think we all eat a lot of French fries. But potatoes are not necessarily the healthiest vegetables that we eat and consume. We grow less than 10% of the fruit that we consume, and almost less than 1% of grains and pulses or animal protein in New England. So if we're trying to be self-sufficient, we have a long way to go, is the point here. And so getting to the point here, what about climate change? So this is our food system. I just gave you a little background about the food system and kind of where we're coming from, some of the challenges, and then this is like the big elephant in our lives, right? Like climate change is here. We're seeing a lot more severity and frequency of storms and droughts and all kinds of extreme weather, temperature increases, whether it's super cold and all of a sudden fruit, chilling of the fruit is too cold and now we lose all of our peach buds, things like that, or it's too hot and things aren't germinating or growing, or all kinds of things that happen. And that really impacts all the things that are happening in the microbial community in the soil, the nutrient availability to plants, impacts our yields, it increases costs for farmers, it throws a whole monkey wrench in all the things that we also just talked about that are already hard in farming. So we're seeing all of these things. Climate change has a huge impact on agriculture. People also say that, well, agriculture has is part of the reason why we have climate change in the first place. Here we have all these cows burping methane and creating all these greenhouse gases and emissions, and we're tilling up the soil and releasing carbon back into the atmosphere, and so it's ag's fault. Or it's ag's solution. It's like there's lots of conversations about we should be paying farmers with carbon credits and doing all these things to kind of shift the tide. But it has a huge impact, as I was just saying. There's a lot of reduction in, obviously, crop yields, reduced productivity, harvests aren't as robust as they might be. The whole timeline of when you plant and when you harvest is affected. Things like that, shorter, longer seasons. If it's too much water, you can't even get in to plant the crops in the first place. If it stays warm like this winter, pest cycles that are normally, hopefully eradicated or at least reduced during the winter months, they're still around, they're hanging out, they're multiplying, they're still thriving, and farmers don't get that break in the seasons. New diseases are moving up from different production zones into other areas. There's a lot of things that people are dealing with and still trying to learn about what's happening out here. And all of that takes new investment and new resources. And where does that come from? If people have to shift to different types of crops, or do we have research programs out there that are working fast enough, thinking about different breeds, more drought tolerant or flood tolerant or salt tolerant or whatever types of crops? Who's doing that research? How fast can they design those new cultivars to get that out? And then do you need new management practices? Do you have to have more labor? Do you not have enough work for labor because now you can't get people out into the field to pick the crops because it's too wet? There's all kinds of added labor and financial costs and expenses and things like that. And it's also impacting the nutritional quality of the food. As I said before, and even the food safety, but increases in carbon dioxide concentrations can reduce the plant's ability to uptake different nutrients from the soil. And it can reduce forage quality for livestock. So all of a sudden, normal processes that were happening in the soil may not be happening in the same way due to climate change. And then, extreme heat and loss, it can also help, you can lose organic matter. The soil isn't able to hold as much carbon as it was before. Lots of water can have more erosion. We lose our topsoil. It's hard on people, the workers working out in extreme heat. Reduces their productivity, so then again you have more costs of labor, and it can create increased pressure on the land. Thinking about here in New England too, if farmers have fields that are drier, that's great in a wet year. If you have heavy wet clay soils, maybe that's better in a dry year. But if you don't have that option to rotate your production between different soil types, what do? Are you just done for the season, or really prevented? So it also is, a lot of people are thinking about, well, how can I get access to more land, or can I try to find more risk management strategies within my land base, and what are some other investments that might need to be made? We just put in a drainage project at one of our sites because there was a 5-acre field we couldn't ever use in a normal year, much less in a really wet year. So people are investing that. When I first moved to the New England area 20 years ago, I would say maybe only 30% of farmers had irrigation on their fields because we regularly got rain. You need an inch a week to grow good quality crops. And now if you don't have irrigation, forget it. You're not going to grow many crops at all. And even if you do have irrigation, it costs a lot to move irrigation pipe, or to pump, or to run the well pump, or things like that, or haul water from field to field. So again, all these things have an economic impact on the farmer and their economic reality. Heat stress in livestock is another issue. These poor critters are living outside in the environment, in the weather all the time. It has an impact on their reproductive abilities, on their health, on the protein quality, eggshell quality. All these things impact livestock in a big way when they're under heat stress. And then all this stress, trying to grow stuff in this unfriendly, unpredictable, changing environment as a farmer, has a lot of stress on our farmers. We're actually talking about mental health in the farming community for the first time in a long time. The federal government's invested money in the farm and ranch stress assistance programs. Our State Department of Agriculture has received federal funding, and now we have mental health farmer support systems in place. Farm Aid's been around since the 80s for this reason, because this is such a stressful, risky business. Farmers commit suicide. And so I think as a society, we're open to talking about mental health. But when your livelihood, your maybe 300 years of legacy, this land's been in your family, whatever the case may be, and you're the last farmer on the line, that's a lot of stress economically and socially and all other ways. So farmer stress is real. Talked a little bit about shifting growing zones, and that impacts ecology as well. As we talked about the 20 by 60 vision, or 50 by 60 vision, if we want to have more land available and things are shifting, ecological zones, are people going to be, again, clearing trees or shifting how the land has been used over time? And those changes have an impact as well. So all these things sound really negative. Sorry, that's just reality. And so then now people are talking about, well, we can do agriculture in a climate smart way. So what does that actually mean? What is climate smart agriculture? I honestly don't think anybody really exactly knows what that is. There's so many definitions out there of what this means. So here are a few. Basically, in summary, is what I found is it's an integrated approach to managing the landscape, right? It's this, managing all these different types of systems that addresses the interlinked challenge of the future of food security and accelerating climate change. So we're going to do all these integrated practices, and hopefully we'll have food in the future and not accelerate climate change. But so yeah, these are some definitions here. I think some of the things that are important on the little list here is that we want to make sure that we're maintaining agricultural productivity and that we're building the resilience of our systems to bounce back from these shocks. I mean, I think that's what climate smart agriculture is like, how do we as humans influence the environment to be able to better withstand these changes and things? How do we help? How do we adapt? How do we manage the ecosystem in a way that it can adapt to these things? And how do we mitigate, all the different issues that are going on at the same time in a system? How do we, employ science-based actions? How do we demonstrate that these things actually work? And then what are the trade-offs that we have to do to achieve these climate-smart goals? And one of the last bullets I think is really important is like, there's no one-size-fits-all. We can't just say, well, this is a climate-smart practice and rubber stamp it on every farm across the country and it's going to work the same every way, right? This is a living ecological system. Things don't work that way. Things need to be done differently in different places, different climates, different soil types, all the systems that we talked about before, political, there's political issues here, there's, policy issues, there's all kinds of things that come into play in the whole food system, that there's not really, one size fits all climate smart ag practice that's going to solve all of this for us. So here's what USDA defines as climate smart practices. And this is not the long list. If you would like to go to this website, there's another list that the Natural Resources Conservation Department of USDA, who funds these types of practices. They have a much longer 3-page list of different practices that they fund that they call climate smart. But these are just some of the things, implementing soil health practices. Well, what does that mean? There's a lot of things you can do. You could study get a whole degree in soil health and biology. But farmers, do things to improve soil health, like by planting cover crops. Don't leave the soil bare all winter long. Plant a forage crop or a deep tap-rooted crop to break up some of the compaction or hard pan or things like that might happen. Maybe plant a leguminous crop to add some nitrogen-fixing modules on the bottom of the plants. Leave residue in the fields. Keep the soil covered so that if there is a huge water event, you're not going to wash the soil away, or that you're, again, building more organic matter to incorporate back into the soil. Don't till the land. Using more no-till or low-till. Every time you till and turn over the soil, you're releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So keeping that in place with minimal tillage or no tillage, using buffer strips, filter strips, planting edges of fields, borders with native plants or pollinators, things like that. Managing nutrients. Figuring out what kinds of fertility can stay in the soil in all of these different climate situations, and how do you manage that well? How are you making sure that you're putting on just what the plant needs at just the right time and not more than that, so that it doesn't just wash away and become another environmental problem? Managing manure, feed management. I love the enteric emissions. You know what that is, right? So what comes out of the other end of the cow. So that now people are trying to develop new feed regimens to feed cattle, different combinations of nutrients and things in their feed to hopefully eliminate some of the methane that comes out on the other side. So different practices like that. We talked a little bit about buffers, more agroforestry, planting trees, planting for higher carbon sequestration rates, paying more attention to the forest, soil floor and soil quality. There's also pasture management, prescribed grazing, legume interseeding, and then people are playing around with biochar and other things. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's lots and lots of examples of what people are doing to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and incorporate some more sustainable practices than we have been. And so one of the questions was, well, how do we get farmers to do these things, right? Like if you're producing things and your goal is to run a business and you have all these costs, and if you're a commodity farmer and you're a price taker, you're getting the prices that are set by the market, which is increasingly consolidated. So there are very few places to take your crop, and you're being told, well, this is what you're going to get. How are you going to become incentivized to do all these extra things? You know, it's one thing to just till it up, put the seeds in the ground, harvest it, leave it bare. You've extracted your crop, you've taken it, you've sold it. Now you want me to like be taking soil tests and planting cover crops, which is an expense. It's seed, it's fuel, it's labor, it's time, and cover the soil. If you've ever driven around in the Midwest, you know people don't cover crop religiously. You see all these like stubble chopped silage corn or other kinds of feed corn, and the soil is bare. And then they just come in the next year, till it up, plant the crop, extract it, put on all the chemical fertilizers, and that's the economic model. It's how people are paid. I'm not even going to get into all the things about crop insurance and how our federal government subsidizes farmers to do the kind of practices that they do. And a lot of it's based on insurance because we've talked about farming is so risky. You want to insure, if you're growing one big crop like soybeans or corn, you're going to be insured because if any of this stuff happens, you want to make sure that you get paid for that. So people have established yield values and all these other actuarial things to decide how they're going to pay out crop insurance claims if something happens. So you don't want to be messing around with this formula and doing something new and different if you're not going to be paid because you might be impacting your yields in some way as you're getting these practices up and running. So some ways that we can incentivize this is obviously, can we expand our knowledge that these things actually work? If we're going to go to and try to encourage farmers to do more of this, do they work? Are they effective? And how do we measure that? How do we demonstrate that evidence? And then, what are the policies in place that are really incentivizing it? It's a systems change question. People will do things based on different kinds of incentives, whether it's financial or carrot and stick or whatever the case may be. There need to be supports and incentives and or requirements in place that that enable people to make changes in this way. And so that has to come through cooperation and coordination of lots of different institutions and stakeholders, funding, financing options, and then practice. Like people actually have to do the things and learn from each other. And farmers love to learn best from other farmers. If someone across the field fence there is doing it and they're having good results, that's going to spread these practices faster, much faster than some potential incentives or other punitive actions if people aren't doing things. And regulation is very punitive. Like you cannot put this on at this time because it will pollute the water. Like we have those kinds of incentives as well as like you can't do this. So some of the programs and policies that we have in the U.S. here that are incentivizing some of these climate smart agriculture practices are largely administered through the United States Department of Agriculture. And so there was just a recent last fall environmental working group analysis of, well, how much money are we actually spending on incentivizing farmers to do if we lump climate smart ag into conservation practices as a whole, we spend about $7.5 billion over that 3-year period in our conservation programs. But really only in the two big conservation programs are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program. But really not a whole lot of that funding actually went to funding these, what USDA themselves calls these climate smart agriculture practices. So they're not really putting a lot of investment in that, or haven't been at least. And then we came and we have this huge influx of resources now with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is targeting, almost 3 times the amount that we've done in the last 3 years now, investing $19.5 billion with a capital B in new conservation funding. There's also some other funding that we have through ARPA and other things I'll mention in a second to support climate smart ag. The Biden administration is fully on board with climate smart ag. We've got to do something about this, and we're going to try to invest in it. So a new grant program that came out last spring was called this Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. This was also, almost another $3 billion from money that came from elsewhere, and they funded 171 projects across the country. I applied for one, I didn't get my grant, but to define, they basically said, well, we want you to work with farmers and figure out what they can do on their farms. We want to help define, you can define what climate smart practices are. They also had their laundry list of what they said some of these things could be. Get these projects out there on the ground across the country, measure how much greenhouse gas emissions you're reducing by doing these practices, and create marketing plans so that we can gain more value in the consumer community. So what does it mean to brand a product climate smart product, right? So like, are we going to now go into the supermarket and see a label saying this product was grown using climate smart practices, just like we see the USDA, certified organic label. So all these projects that were just funded are to get money into the hands of farmers, to do some of these things, to do research around it, demonstrations. You can read all the abstracts online about what they funded across the country. It's really quite interesting. But there needs to be, material measurement and evaluation of these practices and figuring out how consumers are going to respond to the messaging around what farmers are doing. And this is, again, how a lot of the money is going to be spent in some of this funding. It's not all going to go to NRCS and these EQIP and CSP funds, but mostly 45% of it to conservation, some to rural development, which has a lot of grant programs for farmers in different areas, some to loans and some to forestry practices. So, and then, as I said, the Inflation Reduction Act was coupled already with the Infrastructure Act and the American Rescue Plan funding. So it's really created, I said 19.5, that's the new money, coupled with some of this other money. There's over $40 billion that's going into USDA programming to promote climate smart agriculture, energy efficiency programming, forest conservation, and all kinds of other things. So a lot to say there, but this is a lot of new money for programs that are historically really oversubscribed, which means more farmers apply for this funding than we've ever had to give it to them. And one of the other challenges that we have, especially here in Massachusetts, is that we don't have enough federal staff to process all of the paperwork that requires to access these federal programs. So, on our project in my organization, we had wanted to get an EQIP project to look at some conservation practices and things like that. And in 2021, we had initially applied, and we were number 56 on the list of farms that were ahead of us to get a conservation planner to come to the farm to help walk the field and see what our resource concerns were and talk about projects that we could do and this and that. Even this year, we have lovely people at NRCS. They really want to work with small farms and want to help, but I got our application in for our EQIP grant, again, after we didn't hear from anyone in 2021 or 2022. I said, okay, I'm knocking on your door again. I didn't forget about this. We're still interested, and we've been working with them since December. And there was a deadline for these programs. So I got it in January for the February 17th deadline. And the person in charge of our paperwork was like, oh, we'll get you in the next round, which there's only one more round in May. So I'm still waiting. And so one of the things that these funds are going to do is hopefully provide more staffing on the ground for the federal government to have the capacity to process these and work with farmers. Because the process to get these funds means that you need to actually have a conservation planner come visit you on your farm, walk the fields, talk about your goals, and they may have a very different perspective of what's fundable because there's so many technical requirements for what each of these programs fund and how it works, and there's some strategy around thinking about what you ask for first and second and third and all the different things. So a lot of times it's a little mysterious to a farmer. Some farmers know these programs really well, some don't. And so it just takes a little bit of time to get into the system and to then get in the queue, and then you're ranked. So because there's always usually more demand than funding, you go through this whole process, and then they have a ranking and scoring criteria of how much impact is the project going to have. So you may go through all this and you may still not actually get funding. So this new infusion of capital is a good thing, and hopefully it will have more capacity to help kind of unstick the pipeline of projects, and there'll be more money available, and we can get more of these practices out on the ground in real life. So these are just some other things that they're working on. It's too small to read all that, but just really also the big push in 2023. Again, there's, like I said, there's pages and pages of what these priorities are, but this year their main priority that I was just reading about in an announcement was really focused on nutrient management initiatives. So those may be prioritized ahead of other things. So at the local level, our state Department of Agriculture is also prioritizing climate smart practices and energy efficiency. So they have what's called their Climate Smart Agriculture Program at the state level. It combines what used to be the energy programs, and they had a smaller climate program, into one application. So part of what I also feel like is a good thing that's been happening in the last many years is people are paying more and more attention to accessibility and equity in these programs, and who has access to the federal funding, who has knowledge of it, who knows how to work the system. And so a lot of the funders, both the federal government, are paying for a lot of outreach partnerships with community-based organizations to get the word out in underrepresented farming communities to make sure that more people can access these programs who have been historically either discriminated against or not funded in these type of federal funding programs. So the Climate Smart Ag program, all that to say that MDAR has been trying to also pay attention to the equity issue and make their application processes for state grants more streamlined and more accessible and available. So by kind of combining all these into one application, that makes it a little bit simpler to access. And so there's the acre grant, some of these ag environmental enhancement programs, and the ag energy program. Some of the challenges with accessing these programs, especially if you're a new and beginning farmer, is like, do you have the land tenure? Do you have a long enough lease to make to be eligible for these programs? If you're going to put in a practice that's going to take 2 or 3 years to achieve results, are you going to be ranked high on a priority list if you only have a 3-year lease compared to someone that owns their land or has a 10-year lease or a 20-year lease? So sometimes that, when we talked about earlier, access to land, if you don't have secure land tenure, you may want to do all these practices because you believe in it and you want to do it, and there's help for you to do it, but you may not even be eligible because you don't have control of the land for the life of the practice. So those are some of the other challenges that come up with some of these programs. So it has to be an ag use and managed as a commercial enterprise. How do we define commercial enterprise? That's another thing. Most people are always like, well, how do you know if you're a farmer? And so the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service basically defines a farmer as someone that's made $1,000 of gross revenue by selling an agricultural product. So it's a kind of, I don't want to say it's a low bar, but it's not, you don't have to sell that much product to make $1,000 to be considered a farmer or an enterprise, or to file a Schedule F on your taxes to demonstrate that you're actually a farm and generating revenue. So that was the climate part. I hope I gave everyone enough of a background on kind of what's going on, what the landscape is. I would just say that I think a lot of this is still new. It's not that new. I mean, we can talk about indigenous practices and traditional ecological knowledge, and like there's been a lot of amazing things that have happened for millennia that humans have done in agriculture. But I think now that the climate crisis is continually at the fore of a lot of agendas and things, that more and more people are trying to figure out, well, what do we do about this? How do we use agriculture and this land base and this potential for carbon sequestration in the best way possible? But I just wanted to be clear that there are just a lot of realities and challenges in making that happen quickly, because there's so much risk, and farmers are already balancing and dealing with risk that without these financial incentives or other economic drivers that are going to push someone to do something new and different, it's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask of folks that are already on the margins of the kind of businesses that they run. So should I stop there for questions, or should I quickly talk about new entry? I can pause here, or we can go through a little bit of background about. Okay, perfect. Great.
I'll ask a question. So I'm curious, thinking about, so you're 20-some years with new entry, incubating these new farmers, and also thinking about that long list of practices that maybe we don't have sort of quantified as to their climate benefits, but we know they're good for agriculture. Have you seen sort of any changes over that 20-year period in terms of the practices that people are using, or those that are more popular, or how they're using them? Has there been a shift, or is it not?
No, there's definitely been a shift. I mean, and just a caveat too, I work with very small scale vegetable farmers. So the type of agriculture that I work in every day is very different from like large scale industrial commodity agriculture. So the farmers that I work with are already at a scale, they're already selling directly to consumers, they're already kind of organic, sustainable minded, they care about the soil, they care about the health of their product, and most of them are farming organically. And so the changes that I've seen is there's a big growing popularity in no-till vegetable production, which is the hardest thing to do with no-till because you actually have to open the soil and put the seeds in, and weeds and all kinds of other things, and really be careful about nutrient management to grow high-quality vegetables. But there are a lot of kind of what I call the gurus that are out there that are really promoting no-till, small-scale, hand-scale, sustainable agriculture. But what that requires, and we're seeing a lot of tarping, a lot of mulching, a lot of handwork. And so that requires a lot more labor, which is much more expensive. I mean, right now, if you look at job postings for farm jobs, people are paying $18 to $25 an hour for farm labor, which is a lot, which is great. I think it's by time that we respect the profession and pay people what they're worth and pay living wages, but it just means like, how do you make a living selling tomatoes and lettuce and herbs unless you're gonna sell to the most privileged economic portion of a society, and everybody eats. So we haven't even talked about food security and food access and any of that, but that's a whole other question. And a lot of our farmers really care about that too. So it's kind of balancing trying these new production systems that are more labor intensive and costly, and it's expensive to buy in good quality organic compost if you don't make it on site. It's expensive to buy in mulch. It's expensive to pay a lot of labor to weed. So yeah, it just costs a lot more.
So how do you reconcile the sort of the fact that just given the nature of food production in New England and the size, and like you said, it would require chopping down way too many trees how do you reconcile the fact that small local farming cannot create enough food for New England? However, you also denounce a lot of the practices that make it remotely possible to produce enough food to feed the people. You get what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think that's part of the challenge. It really depends on how willing are we to change the way that we eat and the types of products that we eat. And we used to grow a lot of grains here in New England. We used to, a lot of dairy, a lot of protein, lots of small scale farms, crop storage year round, all of that. So we were fairly self-sufficient. I would never say we were ever 100% self-sufficient, no way. But then as we moved westward across this landscape and whatnot, we realized there are better soils elsewhere that can produce these crops more efficiently. And so we just moved in that direction. I'm not saying that we could ever I'm not saying we should go back to that, but I do think that we could support a lot more small, local, regional scale production in this region and probably be a little more food secure, and then be more conscientious of the kinds of agriculture that we support that happens elsewhere so that it is also done more sustainably, because economies are always based on trade and exchange, right? Like we're always going to want to buy things that we can't produce wherever in our communities or elsewhere. And so just have to think about what grows best where, and maybe most efficiently, but maybe most ecologically, and then can we replicate that in ways that are ecologically sound? Because I think that's the other thing that we've done, is created these monocultures that are not ecologically sustainable or sound. And we've taken, small replicated farms that could all do different things in a local regional economy and just blown it up. And I don't think that's sustainable. I mean, my vision, whether it's too Pollyanna or optimistic, is I would just love to see lots and lots of small and mid-size local and regional farms in different economies, and then where it makes sense to have larger production, but do it in a way that is regenerative and sustainable and not monoculture extractive. And it's going to be less efficient, and that's just the reality that we haven't been willing to accept, right? Like we're always, that capitalism, as we've talked about, is get bigger and bigger and bigger and more efficient at whatever cost. And we've ignored those costs long enough. I think it's time to pull that back and think about the full cost and what are we willing to live with. Yeah.
Do you guys encourage like backyard farming, non-commercial farming at all?
That's not part of our mission, but definitely think anyone who wants to grow food anywhere for whatever reason, amen. Like, let's have more of that. So the Northeast Organic Farming Association, NOFA Mass, they're one of our partners. They definitely do a lot of backyard gardening workshops and really encourage people to do that. And I love community gardening programs. I mean, I think we need to teach more agricultural literacy from like the time we're born. We should know where food comes from and like how it gets to our plate. And like we've gotten far from that. There is a new bill on the floor right now in the legislature to support, it's called the Ag Literacy Bill actually, to support more farm to school education programming and make that part of built-in curriculum in Massachusetts. So y'all should talk to your legislators and say, please support this bill, because I think that will go a long way to people really understanding a lot of these issues and knowing where food comes from and caring about all the things that are happening, because we can't live for too long without food. So, yes.
One of the things that you mentioned was like farms that are in production now and don't necessarily have that like next generation coming for transition. And I was just wondering if that fits in at all to the project that is helping up and coming farmers. Like, is there an element of that that's transitioning from old farmers to new farmers and like creating those pathways?
Yeah, definitely. We work a lot with Land for Good, which is another nonprofit organization, and they do a series of succession schools for farmers that are, at that retirement age and are looking for them to also think about like, well, what are their goals for their property and like, what are their planning steps and things like that. So there's kind of that side working with those retiring landowners. We don't do that work. Land for Good does that work. Our job is really kind of making sure that there is a pipeline of future farmers. So we're outreaching, I call it our big funnel, right? Like we have to get people, understanding that this is the reality of starting an agricultural business. You're working in this kind of food system with all these challenges, but like if you put all the pieces together right, like, and customers really believe in this system and want to support local, like you can make money farming. Like this all sounds really negative, but people are making money farming. Not easily, but you can do it as long as you're like really business minded and have the skills and the market and know your cost of production and like line up a gazillion things and maybe have a little bit of luck and privilege in there too. But I think it is possible. And so we're really focused on that kind of big pipeline because the more people we can get interested, they're going to weed themselves out and they're going to face challenges. And then at the end, we'll have hopefully enough people. And we need many more projects like ours. One of our other programs is a national network of other land-based training programs across the country because one little project here in eastern Massachusetts isn't going to train enough farmers to go out on the land and take over all those businesses. So I think we're lucky now, colleges have farm programs and kids are, we went to a couple of career fairs in our local middle school and high school, and ag was one of the popular career tracks. I was shocked. I was like, oh, this is great. This is like hopeful. So just also, I think, you as a younger generation too are really like care about these issues more. And I think more people are paying attention and, potentially interested. So that's our job, is hopefully capture that interest and give people the skills and knowledge and experience to make it successful. And then connect them up with hopefully these retiring farmers.
So I know we've come to the end. We need to make sure that the students can get to the cafeteria to eat. But I always invite anyone who has any lingering questions to come up and ask a few questions individually. I want to thank you again very much for your presentation and for your attention and the questions. Come back again next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.